Human gave alien girl his seat on last escape pod. 8 years later, she came back. In the dying light of a collapsing star, Ashton shoved the final civilian into the venting hatch of the last evacuation vessel, his hands steady despite the groaning metal of the station. He turned to the woman frozen in the doorway, her skin the color of deep twilight and eyes wide with the terror of a species that had never known total extinction. Leeloo reached for him, her fingers trembling as the sirens wailed a funeral dirge for the system. "There is no more room," she whispered, her voice a melodic fracture in the chaos. "There is now." Ashton replied, his voice a low growl of human certainty as he physically lifted her, ignoring her gasp of protest. He strapped her into the pilot's jump seat, the very seat he was meant to occupy as the lead navigator. "You will die," she cried out, her hand catching his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "I'll be fine," he lied, his thumb grazing the soft, alien velvet of her knuckles before he slammed the manual override, sealing the pod and launching the only thing he cared about into the cold, safe void. 8 years later, the silence of the frontier was shattered not by a distress signal, but by a gravitational wake so powerful it bent the light of the nearby nebula. Ashton, scarred and graying at the temples, watched from the porch of his makeshift homestead as a ship of impossible geometry descended. It wasn't a rescue craft. It was a sovereign dreadnought, draped in the banners of the Aran hegemony, and it was landing in his dirt. The ramp hissed open, revealing a figure silhouetted against a shimmering gold internal atmosphere. Leeloo stepped onto the dust, her regal robes trailing behind her, yet her eyes remained fixed on the man who had traded his life for hers. She didn't speak initially, her gaze raking over his rugged frame, nodding the way his heavy muscles shifted under a sweat-stained shirt. "You kept your word," she said, the translator now unnecessary as she had mastered his tongue. "I'm a hard man to kill," Ashton said, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "I have spent every rotation since that fire searching for the ghost who saved a queen." She stepped closer, the scent of exotic spices and heat radiating from her. "A queen?" he asked, a dry chuckle escaping his throat. "I was a princess then," she corrected, stopping inches from him, her height nearly matching his. "Now I am the sovereign, and I have come to claim my debt." She reached out, her cool fingertips tracing the jagged scar along his jawline, a remnant of the station's final explosion. Ashton didn't flinch, instead leaning into the touch, his own hand rising to cover hers, the contrast of his calloused, sun-darkened skin against her ethereal glow a visual testament to their worlds colliding. "I didn't do it for a reward," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave as the tension between them thickened into something heavy and electric. "Then you will loathe what I have planned," she whispered, her eyes darkening with a hunger that was entirely universal. She turned to the guards flanking the ramp, her posture shifting into one of absolute command. "Leave us," she commanded, the alien soldiers retreating instantly into the bowels of the great ship. "You've grown powerful," Ashton noted, his eyes tracking the fluid, predatory grace of her movements. "I have grown lonely," she countered, closing the distance until their chests brushed, the heat of his body causing a visible shimmer in her atmospheric veil. "In my culture, a life given creates a bond that transcends law." She took his hand, guiding it to the center of her chest, where a secondary heart throbbed with a frantic, rhythmic beat. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her breath hitching. "It's fast," he said, his fingers curling slightly against the silk of her gown. "It has not slowed since the moment you pushed me into that pod," she confessed, her eyes searched his, looking for the man she remembered. "I am not the girl you saved," she added, her voice dropping to a silken thread. "I can see that," Ashton replied, his gaze dropping to her lips, which were parted in an unspoken invitation. "Then show me the human ingenuity I have heard so much of," she challenged, her hand sliding up his arm to grip the back of his neck, pulling him down toward her. The kiss was not a gentle reunion. It was a collision of 8 years of grief, longing, and the stubborn human refusal to stay dead. Ashton wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off the ground as if she weighed nothing, his strength a startling reminder of the gravity-heavy world that had forged him. Leeloo let out a soft, melodic moan, her legs wrapping around his hips, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in her universe. "You're shaking," he whispered against her skin, his mouth moving to the sensitive curve of her neck. "It is the atmosphere," she lied, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. "Is it?" he teased, his teeth grazing her collarbone, sending a jolt of electricity through her that made her skin glow a vibrant, pulsing indigo. "Take me inside," she demanded, her voice no longer that of a sovereign but a woman possessed. He carried her into the small, dim cabin, the contrast between the high-tech dreadnought outside and the hand-hewn timber of his home stark. He set her on the edge of the heavy wooden table, his hands never leaving her body. "I thought about this every night," he admitted, his eyes burning with a raw intensity that made her breath catch. "And did I look like this in your dreams?" she asked, her hands reaching for the buttons of his shirt, her movements frantic yet precise. "No," he said, helping her discard the fabric. "You were always a memory. This is better." As his shirt hit the floor, revealing a torso mapped with the history of his survival, Leeloo ran her hands over the ridges of his muscles, her touch reverent. Humans were so dense, so biologically stubborn. "You are so warm," she marveled, her palms flat against his chest. "That's the humanity in me," he said, his hands finding the fastenings of her royal attire. "Let's see what's under all this gold." The layers fell away, revealing skin that shimmered like a nebula under the low light of the cabin. She was a masterpiece of alien evolution, elegant and lithe, yet as she looked at him, she felt small in the most intoxicating way. "I came back to save you from this dirt," she whispered, her voice trembling as he pressed her back against the table. "Maybe I don't want to be saved," he countered, his weight settling between her thighs, the physical dominance of his stature making her feel a thrill of surrender she had never permitted herself in the hegemony. "Then I shall stay here in the dirt with you," she promised, her back arching as he found a particularly sensitive spot along her ribs. The intimacy was a language they both spoke fluently, a bridge across light years. Ashton moved with a deliberate slowness, testing her reactions, watching the way her eyes changed color with every touch. He was a man who understood the mechanics of survival, and now he applied that same focus to her pleasure. "Wait," she gasped, her hands catching his shoulders. "There is something you must know." "Tell me," he murmured, his lips against her temple. "The hegemony. They didn't want me to find you," she said, her eyes welling with a sudden, sharp clarity. "They think humans are a contagion. They sent me to ensure the last witness was silenced." Ashton went still, his eyes locking onto hers. And I told them I would handle it personally." She reached for a hidden compartment in her discarded belt, pulling out a small, pulsing data core. "This contains the coordinates of every human survivor the hegemony has been hiding in labor camps. I didn't just come back for you, Ashton. I came back for the revolution." The revelation hung in the air, shifting the dynamic from personal passion to galactic consequence. Ashton took the core, his expression hardening into the soldier he had once been. "You risked your throne for this?" he asked, his thumb tracing the glowing device. "I risked it for the man who taught me that a single life is worth more than a star system," she replied, her voice steadying. "But now, I need that man to lead them." "I'm a farmer now, Leeloo," he said, though the fire in his eyes betrayed him. "You are a leader of men," she insisted, sitting up and pulling him back into her embrace. "And you will have the full might of my personal fleet. We will redefine the balance of the sector." "You really don't do things by halves, do you?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "Never," she smiled, and for a moment, the weight of the galaxy vanished, replaced by the simple, profound heat of two bodies reclaiming what was lost. He kissed her again, this time with a fierce, possessive claim. If they were to go to war, if they were to burn the hegemony to the ground to free his people, he would do it with her by his side. "Tonight," he whispered, "we aren't soldiers or sovereigns." "Tonight," she agreed, We are just a man and a woman." The night deepened, the cabin becoming a sanctuary against the impending storm. Their movements became a synchronized dance of necessity and desire. Ashton marveled at the resilience of her form, the way she met his strength with a quiet, enduring power of her own. She was the vacuum to his pressure, the star to his void. Outside, the dreadnought's lights flickered, a silent sentinel over the small shack. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sweat and the earthy musk of the frontier. Leeloo cried out as he drove them both toward a peak that felt like a supernova, her fingers digging into his back, leaving marks that would fade long before her memory of this moment did. As they lay together in the aftermath, the data core glowing softly on the nightstand, Ashton stroked her hair, watching the way her breathing settled into a peaceful rhythm. "They'll come for us," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Let them," she murmured, her head resting on his chest. "They have no idea what a human can do when he has something to live for." "And what about you?" he asked. "What do you have to live for?" She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a mixture of love and defiance. "I have a seat on a pod that was never meant for me," she said. "I intend to make it count." The next morning, the sons of the frontier rose over a world that was no longer just a hiding place. Ashton stood on the ramp of the dreadnought, clad in a flight suit that felt like a second skin, the data core secured in his palm. Beside him, Leeloo stood in her full regalia, her hand tucked firmly into the crook of his arm. "Are you ready?" she asked, the command in her voice returning, tempered by the softness in her gaze. "I've been ready for 8 years," he said, looking out at the horizon. The ship's engines began to hum, a vibration that resonated in his marrow. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was an awakening. The hegemony had underestimated the human capacity for sacrifice, and now they would learn the cost of human vengeance. "Transmission coming in," one of the bridge officers, a tall male named Zev, announced as they stepped onto the command deck. "It's the High Council. They're demanding to know why the witness hasn't been neutralized." Leeloo looked at Ashton, a silent question in her eyes. He stepped forward, his presence filling the bridge, the alien crew turning to look at the primitive creature who stood beside their queen. "Put them through," Ashton commanded, his voice echoing with the authority of a species that had survived its own extinction. The holographic display shimmered to life, revealing a row of austere, gray-skinned elders. "Sovereign," the lead elder began, his voice like grinding stone, "report the status of the human." Ashton stepped into the light of the holocam, his face a mask of grim determination. "The status of the human is armed and dangerous," he said, the smirk returning to his lips. "And we're coming for our people." The elder's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his features before the connection was severed. Leeloo laughed, a bright, dangerous sound that filled the bridge. "I think you surprised them," she said. "Humans are good at that." Ashton replied, his hand finding hers on the console, their fingers interlocking. The dreadnought pivoted, its massive engines glowing as it tore a hole in the fabric of space. As they plunged into the slipstream, Ashton didn't look back at the planet he had called home for nearly a decade. He looked forward, toward the stars where his people waited, and toward the woman who had crossed the galaxy to find him. The journey was long, and the nights on the ship were spent in the quiet intensity of their shared resolve. In the private sanctum of her quarters, the war felt far away. There, they were simply Ashton and Leeloo, two fragments of a broken universe trying to make themselves whole. "You never told me how you survived," she said one evening, her hand tracing the muscles of his back as they watched the stars streak past the viewing port. "I found an old freighter in the wreckage," he explained, his voice hushed. "It had just enough air and a lot of luck. I spent 3 months drifting before I hit the frontier." "And you never tried to find us?" she asked, her voice tinged with a hint of sadness. "I thought you were safe," he said, turning to face her. "I thought the best thing I could do for you was stay dead. I didn't want the hegemony looking for you because of me." "You were protecting me," she realized, her heart aching with the weight of his sacrifice. Always, he promised, his lips meeting hers in a soft, lingering kiss. The first camp was located on the moons of Aquila. It was a desolate, frozen rock, guarded by automated sentries and a skeleton crew of hegemony enforcers. When the dreadnought dropped out of warp, the defense systems didn't even have time to cycle. Ashton led the boarding party, his movements a blur of tactical efficiency. He didn't use the advanced energy weapons of the hegemony. He used a modified human kinetic rifle, the thunderous cracks of the shots echoing through the sterile halls, a sound of pure terror for those who had forgotten the sound of a bullet. He smashed through the final door of the barracks, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Inside, dozens of humans, gaunt and weary, looked up in disbelief. "Who are you?" One of them, a man named Gideon, asked, his voice trembling. "I'm the guy who's taking you home," Ashton said, his eyes scanning the crowd until he found the children. He signaled to the transports, and within the hour, the camp was empty. As the last survivor was ushered onto the dreadnought, Ashton stood on the icy surface of the moon, looking up at the sky. Leeloo landed her shuttle beside him, stepping out into the biting wind. "We did it," she said, her face glowing with triumph. "One down," he agreed, 42 to go. "Then we had better get started," she smiled, taking his hand and leading him back toward the ship. The liberation of the human labor camps became a legend that swept through the sector. Stories of the ghost of the frontier and the rebel queen inspired other subjugated species to rise. The hegemony, once an immovable monolith, began to crumble under the weight of its own arrogance. In the midst of the chaos, Ashton and Leeloo became the heart of the rebellion. They were more than just leaders. They were a symbol of what was possible when two worlds stopped fighting and started loving. During the final siege of the hegemony capital, the battle was fierce. The air was filled with the screams of starfighters and the blinding flashes of orbital strikes. Ashton was in the thick of it, his ship weaving through the defensive grid with a daring that bordered on suicidal. "You're going too fast," Leeloo shouted over the comms, her own ship providing cover fire. "I've got a seat to get back to," he yelled back, his hands dancing over the controls. He punched through the main hangar doors of the council's spire, his ship skidding to a halt amidst the wreckage. He leapt from the cockpit, his rifle at the ready, and fought his way toward the throne room. He found the High Council cowering behind a shimmering shield. He didn't fire. He simply waited. A moment later, the roof of the spire was sheared away by the primary beam of the dreadnought. Leeloo descended on a grav platform, her robes billowing like wings of fire. "It's over," she announced, her voice amplified to reach every corner of the city. "The hegemony is dissolved. The stars belong to everyone now." The elders fell to their knees, their power stripped away by a woman they had tried to use, and a man they had tried to ignore. As the sun set over the liberated capital, Ashton and Leeloo stood on the balcony of the spire, looking out at the city as the fires of war were replaced by the lights of celebration. "What happens now?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Now," she said, turning in his arms, "we build something better. Together." "Always," she promised. She pulled him into a kiss that tasted of victory and the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. The human who had given up his seat on a pod had finally found where he belonged, not in the dirt of a frontier world, but in the heart of a queen who had never stopped looking for him. The galaxy was vast, and the challenges ahead were many, but as Ashton looked into Leeloo's eyes, he knew that they were ready. They were the architects of a new era, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most logical thing a human can do is the most impossible. "I love you," he whispered, the words simple and true. "I know," she smiled, the human phrase sounding perfect in her melodic voice. They stood there for a long time, two souls bound by a choice made in the fire of a dying star, watching the birth of a new universe. Years later, the story of the navigator and the sovereign was told in every corner of the peaceful sector. It was a story of a seat given and a kingdom gained. But for Ashton and Leeloo, it was simply the story of how they found home in each other. They retired to the small cabin on the frontier, the dreadnought now a museum orbiting the planet. They spent their days in the quiet rhythm of the seasons, and their nights in the familiar heat of their shared passion. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked one night, as they sat on the porch watching the nebula. "Regret what?" he asked, pulling her closer. "Giving up your seat." He laughed, the sound warm and rich. "It was the best navigation decision I ever made," he said, kissing the top of her head. "It led me straight to you." She leaned against him, her skin shimmering in the starlight. "Then I suppose I should thank that collapsing star," she teased. "Thank me instead," he murmured, his hand sliding down to the small of her back. "I have much better ways of showing my appreciation." She laughed, the sound echoing through the quiet woods, a melody of pure, unadulterated joy. In the end, it wasn't the wars they won or the empires they built that mattered. It was the way his hand felt in hers, the way his breath hitched when she touched him, and the way they both knew, without a doubt, that they would do it all over again in a heartbeat. The human capacity for love was, after all, the most impressive thing about them. And as the stars twinkled above, silent witnesses to a legend, two lovers slept in the peace they had fought so hard to earn. The legacy of their union lived on in the children who bore both the strength of earth and the grace of the stars. They were the first of a new generation, a bridge between worlds that would never again be separated by fear. And in the center of the capital, a statue stood, not of a soldier or a queen, but of a man reaching out to a woman as a pod door closed between them. The inscription was simple, written in a dozen languages so all could understand. "The greatest strength is the courage to let go." But for Ashton and Leeloo, the greatest strength was the courage to hold on, across time, space, and the very limits of what was thought possible. They had redefined their destiny, and in doing so, they had given the galaxy a reason to believe in the impossible once more. As the final light of the evening faded, the cabin remained a beacon of warmth. The human and the alien, the farmer and the sovereign, were just two people, lost in the beautiful, messy, and infinitely complex reality of being alive and being together. And that was more than enough.